What was the one book in 2024 that emotionally devastated you? A book that you just connected with on a human level? Let me know down below. Hey there, I'm Alicia, and today we're going to be talking about my top 10 fiction books that I read in 2024. I will be making another video of my top nonfiction books that I read, as well as a separate book of my least favorite books and also some of my most surprising books, and potentially a video on how my 2024 reading year went. We have quite the array of books, including 2 short story collections on this list, and these are going to be in no particular order. The one thing that all of these books have in common is that they emotionally resonated with me in one way or another. They elicited some sort of emotional reaction, whether they made me really sad or really grateful and hopeful, happy or angry. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into my top books of 2024. I do have some of the physical books with me, so I'll start off by talking about the books that I have on hand and then move on to the books that I read digitally or via audiobook. So the first book on this list is going to be a short story collection that was published this year. This is a debut short story collection by a Salvadorian American author. This is called There is a Rio Grande in Heaven by Ruben Reyes Jr. This is actually a book that took me by surprise, but by the end of it, it ended up being one of my favorite books of the year. It has a speculative nature to these short story collections, and I'm not going to lie, I was initially put off by the cover. I didn't like it, but I took a risk and I started reading it, and from page 1, I could not put it down. Every single story is so imaginative, raw, and unique. And the short stories in this novel center the Salvadorian and Central American perspective. They range from stories about the past and looking into our own history, about current times and the political turmoil that we're in, and also looks to the future and reimagines what a future could look like for immigrants, for people of color, and for Salvadorians. One particular standout in this collection is the final story in this book. It's a choose-your-own-adventure story, but it's a choose-your-own-adventure immigrant take, and depending on which way you go, it has completely different endings, some that are really hopeful and some that will completely devastate you. I really enjoyed this. I don't hear enough people talking about it. If you love short story collections and it even sounds like anything you would want to read, please pick this up. It was fantastic. And Ruben Reyes will be coming out with his debut novel next year, which I will definitely be picking up. The next book on this list is going to be Moon of Turning Leaves. This is by Waubgeshig, and this is actually a sequel to Moon of the Crusted Snow, which is a book that I read a couple of years ago. I would say that if you haven't read of Moon of the Crusted Snow, you technically don't have to. The author does a really great job at setting up the events in this book so that you understand what's going on. However, for you to have the emotional gut punch that I had, I really do think that you should read it if it's a book you haven't already picked up. This story in particular takes place 10 years or so after the events of what happened in Moon of the Crusted Snow. And we are following this tight-knit community that lives in the once Canadian wilderness. The people in this community have adjusted to being independent and resourceful. However, as resources start to dwindle, they make the really difficult decision to venture out into the world and find a new home. So there's a group of people who come together to go and explore south of where they're living to figure out what the hell happened to the rest of the world and to see if there are any other living survivors. This is another one of those books that I just couldn't put down. It's a very quiet, eerie novel, but in the best way possible. The slow build of suspense is palpable. In some parts of the story, I was at the edge of my seat because I wanted to figure out exactly what was happening, whether they were alone or not, whether they would find a new home. And I would say that about the 60% mark of this book, the story really picks up and it's just action-packed from there. It's a story about survival, community, and found family, and I really enjoyed it. The next book on this list is arguably my favorite book of the year, but I haven't made that choice. This book really hit me. It's part of a trilogy. and that is Fevered Star by Rebecca Roanhorse. I cried by the end of this trilogy. If you're not familiar, this is the third book in the Between Earth and Sky trilogy by Rebecca Roanhorse. The first book is Black Sun, and it is this epic multi-POV fantasy story that is set in pre-Columbian times. Roanhorse's writing is descriptive and lush. The world building is incredible. The characters are compelling, morally gray, and human. You can argue that there's some horror elements in this trilogy. There's also tons of political intrigue. If you haven't picked up this series, I cannot recommend it enough. This is probably my favorite series of all time at this point. The next book on this list was actually the very first book that I read in 2024. I was going through a rough time last year, and this book saved me, or felt like it saved me. I just connected so much to the two main characters. It took me on an emotional ride, and that is Anita de Monte Laughs Last by Xochitl Gonzalez. And I actually consumed this as an audiobook at the time, which I highly recommend. The audiobook narrator does such a wonderful job at bringing both of these characters to life. I was cackling, I was laughing, I was sobbing. I had a really good time. We are following two separate characters. The first character that we're following is Anita. She is an up-and-coming Cuban artist in the 1980s, but after her mysterious death, her art ends up pretty much forgotten, even though she made some really great contributions. Now, our second perspective is told through the point of view of Raquel. She is a first-generation Puerto Rican college student attending this very elite university. Raquel is struggling to assimilate and to fit in within this elite university, and there's some choices that she has to make about what her academic journey will be like. Raquel ends up stumbling across some of the works that Anita had put together, and this takes her down a rabbit hole trying to figure out more about herself, Anita, and about Anita's suspicious death and the legacy that she left behind. This has some really great conversations about Latinx people and women in academia, about people of color in academia, about going against the grain and not assimilating. It was a book that was deeply personal to me because I'm also a first-gen Latina who attended a university and had a really difficult time fitting in. And on the other hand, Anita was really sure of herself, and she's very bold and she's very fierce and she challenges the status quo. And it was just really great to see that from a character and to see how these two characters come together. I loved every second of it. I can't wait to read more by this particular author. This next book is really popular on TikTok, or was really popular on TikTok a couple of years ago. I had it on my shelves and didn't pick it up until very recently, but once I did, I love the story. It's completely devastating. It made me sob, but it's also another very hopeful story of survival and love amidst a very difficult time, and that is As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zoulfa Katouh. This, I would say, is a love letter to Syria, the country, the place, and also its people. I didn't know much about the Syrian revolution before diving into this particular novel. It took me completely by surprise. We are following a pharmacy student named Salama, and her country and family have been torn apart. She is left to take care of her brother's wife, who is pregnant, and she also volunteers at the local hospital to take care of her people. This takes place during a very devastating time in Syrian history. It is set amidst the Syrian revolution, so there are a lot of descriptions of depravity and war and violence. However, they're juxtaposed really well with these descriptions of love and community and survival that I really much enjoyed. Salama ends up meeting another character that she falls in love with, who is also taking care of his two younger siblings, and together they must make the really difficult decision of finding a way out or staying and fighting for their home country. It's such a beautifully told story. I really enjoyed this and I'm glad I picked it up. The next book on this list is a book that I've talked about on this channel before. This is Family Meal by Bryan Washington. This is another one of those stories that was just so beautifully told. It's a story about grief, it's a story about community, and it's a story about finding your people after a devastating loss. In this story, we're primarily following our main character, Cam, who has recently lost his partner, Kai, in this very tragic death. Kai was the center of Cam's world, and once he loses Kai, his world is turned upside down. He starts going on promiscuous dates and having lots of sex. He is struggling with his mental health and with his eating disorder, and he seems to be burning all bridges that were available to him. So in an attempt to gain some sense of comfort and to center himself again, he ends up moving back home where he reconnects with his old best friend and lover, TJ, and we get to learn more about their relationship and why they ended up falling out. It's beautiful and gritty, and I loved every second of it. There's mental health representation, there's eating disorder representation, there's Black and Latinx representation, there's gay representation. So much to love about this book. It's fantastic. The next book on this list is another book that took me by surprise. It's one of those books that I picked up at the library, had no idea what it was about except that it had a speculative fiction element, and again, it blew me away. This is Sky Full of Elephants by Cebo Campbell. Now, for those of you that have seen the movie The Happening, this is essentially what happens at the beginning of this book, except it only happens to white people. One day they decide to get up and walk into the nearest body of water and drown themselves. And the people that are left over are left to reimagine what a world without white supremacy and whiteness would look like. The story is told through the perspective of this father-daughter. The father was previously incarcerated, became a professor when this event happened, and several months after, he receives a call from a daughter he didn't know existed. Now, his daughter grew up in a completely different way than he did. She grew up with her white mother, thinking she was white and having trouble accepting her Blackness and loving her Blackness. Now, when she finds out that there is a community forming in a southern state where white people might be alive, she reaches out to her father to go ahead and escort her to the southern state for her to have her family back. So this father and daughter go on this journey to figure out things about each other, things about themselves, and things about the people that they are now living with. There is so much packed into this very small book. We have a main character who is biracial, and she is struggling between what she has previously been told and learned, the realities of the world that she's encountering. It's a story about father-daughter relationship, identity and Black consciousness, history, and what a world can look like when we tap into our empathy and our power. I really enjoyed it. There is more of an explanation to the speculative element, but I won't say anything else. This is a book that you'll just have to pick up and read. Another book on this list is Happiness Falls. This is by Angie Kim. I ended up reading this book early in the year, so it's a book that I forgot about until I went back through my story graph to see what books really resonated with me. And this is one that resonated with me both on an intellectual level but also on an emotional level. At surface level, this is a slow mystery about a father who goes missing when he takes his son on a walk. And from there, we follow both the police investigation into the disappearance of this man, but also the various ways in which it breaks down this seemingly very healthy and effective family. Now, what makes this novel particularly interesting or with added layers is that one, the son Eugene is both nonverbal and he is autistic, and he is the only one who really knows what happened to his dad, but he's not able to communicate that in terms that other people are able to accept. This is also a story from a Korean American perspective and a blended family. And it's also narrated by Eugene's sister Mia, who is this like spunky 20-year-old who's too smart for her own good, highly skeptical. And so this is really a story about her trying to figure out what happened to her dad, but in the process learning so much more about herself and her family. What I particularly enjoyed about this book was the way that it shines light on the ways in which society defines or categorizes intelligence and who is allowed to be part of that conversation or who is included in those definitions. It was super interesting. Again, there's a lot that it made me think about, but it was also a book that resonated with me emotionally and made me cry by the end. There are two more books on this list. The next one is the other short story collection. This is called I'll Give You a Reason by Annell Lopez. And this is another short story collection that primarily centers the immigrant experience, but in this particular short story collection, what is being centered is the Ironbound community in Newark, New Jersey. Some of the themes of this short story collection include identity, the pressure to assimilate, and what is lost in that process. The complex relationships that immigrants have with their parents and their community and their family, and the consequences of what happens when we choose to center ourselves over our community and what those sacrifices are. I think this really resonated with me because my mom is an immigrant to this country, and I often had those mixed feelings of needing to be grateful and needing to follow the footsteps that my parents are laying out for me in order to make their sacrifices worth it. And it took a while for me to parse out those feelings of what my parents wanted versus what I wanted versus what American society wanted for me. If you're someone who can resonate with any of those things, I recommend you pick up this short story collection. The emotional complexity and punch that Annell Lopez packs into these stories is just unmatched. I really enjoyed it, and this is her debut short story collection. The last and final book on this list is And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliot. This is another book that has a very unique speculative element within the story that just takes it to a whole nother level. I completely adored this book. I would say that this is my second favorite book of the year. It's a book that I read very early on, but I have not stopped thinking about it. It's very on the nose with its critique of racism and colonialism and prejudices, and it's also a little trippy and hallucinatory. It also has horror, fantastical, and sci-fi elements, so the story as a whole feels hallucinatory. You never really quite know whether what our main character is experiencing is real or imagined. So in this particular novel, we're following a Mohawk woman named Alice who marries a white man, and she ends up moving into the suburbs of Toronto with her husband and her newborn kid. This is a challenging book for me to talk about because there are so many things that I want to talk about when it comes to this book. Alice aspires to be a writer, and she wants to write stories that pertain to her community in a way that is very authentic and that is not commercialized for the white gaze. On the other hand, she realizes how privileged she is, that she was able to leave her community and have access to running water and not have to worry about food shortages. At the same time, while she's living in this suburb in Toronto, she starts to experience microaggressions that she can't fully vocalize, and her husband is not believing her because he hasn't had these experiences. On the other hand, she's also not connecting with her newborn baby, and she thinks that her baby hates her. And then to top it all off, she's having these like out-of-body hallucinatory experiences, and she doesn't know what's real anymore. Like I mentioned, it's a book that is trippy. It will make you angry. It will make you think. It will make you sad, but it's also hopeful in the way that it talks about reclaiming ourselves and our histories. It's a book that is also non-linear, specifically because of the speculative element in it. I will not say what it is to avoid spoilers. So if any of the elements that I mentioned intrigue you, I highly recommend this one. I already want to reread it. It's such a good book. So those are the top 10 fiction books that I read in 2024. I'm going to make a video for my top nonfiction reads of 2024. Again, let me know down below which book emotionally wrecked you. What was your favorite this year? I would love to know. See you next time. Bye.